Hey there, Tony here from Chronoforge Studios.
In this devlog, we'll be going over my progress this week, which includes the changes I made to indicate the players in stealth, how the gun rig works, and the damage system. One thing that's been on my to-do list was to get the transparency working for the main player material. I was waiting for the model and texture to be returned to me before I took the time to investigate this problem to ensure any fixes wouldn't have to be reworked when the material was updated. I quickly found a method to keep the standard material inputs, which included metallic, specular, roughness, and normal, by changing the blend mode to translucent, which removes them, and then by changing the lighting mode down to surface translucency volume. The problem that I ran into was that when I looked at the performance of the shader changing it from the lit to the optimization view modes and shader complexity, we see that it's both red and white, which are bad and very bad on the performance spectrum. This would be fine if I was going to render each frame out for a cinematic, but for in-game effects, I need something that wouldn't hit the performance as much. I worked on it for a little while before I realized the goal was just to telegraph to the player that you are in stealth. The implementation was not the goal, so I decided to switch to having the glowing bits of the player dim when in stealth to indicate that you were hidden. This was green performance in the shader complexity view and very easy to implement. It's a good example of when you should try to focus on the goal of the code, not the implementation. As you can see here, all we had to do was multiply the emissive texture by an emissive scale value to change the glow level of the various bits. And in code, all we do is scale this value depending on what your stealth level is currently. Often these are design tweaks that can be done to achieve the same effect in a way that saves you time on implementation and will work just as good. I'm also going to add a slight vignette as well when you're in stealth to further reinforce that you're invisible. I also might highlight the character a different color to make it slightly easier to see what you're doing in the shadows, but I'm going to play test it a bit first with different people to see if that's going to be necessary. I initially set up the gun aiming system using animation offsets and angles, but I found it wasn't precise enough and would require me to make custom animations for each weapon, which would have been very time consuming. I was also having issues reliably importing animations since I was doing the retargeting in Unreal and it would behave differently than the blendered version, so the aiming would be slightly wrong. I ultimately went with a system that used animation offsets for the body, but the arms were connected to a gun rig using IK in Unreal for each arm that pointed to a specific point depending on the gun being held. In this example, the green and blue boxes are where the hands are IK pointed to, and I can actually use the keys to turn on and off the retargeting to show that it is actually connected and updating correctly. The gun rig is parented to the player and has an arm that holds the gun in a specific position away from the player, the blue bar. I also set it up so there were maximum constraints that would make it so the distance from the player would be greater when the arm was out fully to the side, and brought in more when the gun was in front of the player to make it look more realistic. I set up a function that would take in recoil data to animate the recoil differently depending on the gun. It did this by adding the recoil data to an array so that it could go through each one that was currently active and choose the highest value out of any of the curves so that recoils could essentially overlap one another. This setup makes it much easier to add new weapons and customize the hold points and recoil without having to make a bunch of different animations. I'll still need to go back and make static hand poses for each of the gun types, but this is a good starting point and will be enough for the initial store page. The last system I worked on this week was the damage and death system for enemy guards. I initially had some issues with the ray trace not working correctly. When setting the capsule on the enemy to the visual layer, it was blocking the ray traces to the mesh even though it was set to ignore the capsule. I corrected the problem by making a trace channel that was identical to the visual channel but called shootable. That shouldn't have fixed the issue, but this is the kind of weirdness that you can run into using Unreal, where recreating a channel with all the identical settings just seems to make it work for some reason. Once I resolved that issue, I set it up so that it would send damage events to the enemy when they were hit, and after losing enough hit points, they would die. I also set it up so it would detect the bone being hit and pass it along so that I could change the multipliers depending on which body part was hit. I only put in temporary hit points and damage calculations for now. Eventually I'll be adding them to the attribute system, but when testing, It's faster to just get things up and running to use basic variables and then change them when needed for the more advanced systems. I also ran into an issue with the montage not stopping at the end, so the enemy would just stand up after the death animation. I found what you had to do was uncheck the Enable Auto Blend Out on the montage for it to stay on the last frame. It's worth noting that if you do that, then when you go to play the montage, you can't just use the onCompleted because onCompleted never happens. You actually have to add a bit more time and then just have that happen in sequence after the montage plays itself. The last thing I had to do was go into the blend tree for the AI and add a condition for when you were dead so that it would just sit there waiting and the character wouldn't drag along the ground as they played the death animation. The results are a good start. The guard dies if you hit him 10 times in the body or once in the head. The enemy doesn't react if you hit them yet, but I won't need that right away since I'm just updating the systems I need for the gameplay video on the Steam store page. One thing I didn't get to this week was the dagger stuff since I worked a bit on stealth, but I'm still in a pretty good spot and a lot of the work I did for the pistols can be applied to all the weapons going forward, so I'm hoping that that's actually going to make everything go much faster going forward.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.